Thousands of Airbnbs and short-term rentals are expected to disappear from rental platforms as New York City begins enforcing tighter restrictions amidst a growing housing shortage. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these regulations had passed a while ago, but the enforcement of these regulations hadn't really been a thing until literally this week. So for years, the city has maintained that existing laws prevent people from renting out homes to guests for less than 30 days, again, short-term rentals, unless the host is present during the stay. Okay, the city also says that no more than 2 guests are allowed to stay at a time and that they must have access to the entire home. So these were the regulations that passed as part of Local Law 18. Now, there continues to be tons of listings though for these short-term rentals, whole apartments, whole homes. And the city has argued that companies like Airbnb are not policing their platforms more aggressively to root out the violators, the individuals who are working against local laws. So city official claimed back in July, in a July court filing, that more than half of Airbnb's 85 million net revenue in 2022 from short-term rentals in New York City came from activity that is illegal. Now, Airbnb disputes this claim, but I would venture to say that there's certainly Airbnb still operating illegally in New York City, which is why they decided to get far more aggressive in enforcing these rules. Now, again, the rules known as Local Law 18 were passed back in January, but enforcement of the new rules didn't begin until Tuesday of this week. So this follows a series of court challenges that were brought forth by these, apps like Airbnb. And the rule requires hosts to register with the city to even be allowed to rent on a short-term basis. So here is a little more detail on what these rules entail.
You cannot rent out your entire apartment for less than 30 days, and hosts can only offer short-term rentals if they remain with their guests in the apartment. Hosts face fines of up to $5,000 per violation. There are about 40,000 Airbnbs in New York, but rampant abuse, that's where hosts rented dozens of units as kind of shadow hotel rooms. That led to a lot of neighbor and building complaints. City council members also say Airbnbs have raised rents in New York since they've taken all that inventory off the normal rental market. Now, hosts say registration is almost impossible. Many have waited months for approval. Thousands of Airbnb listings have already started disappearing from the website. City councils in Dallas, Philadelphia, New Orleans have passed similar rules. So far, they haven't had much effect because they're so hard to enforce.
No, look, he is right that they are hard to enforce. But what New York is doing is they're essentially putting the onus on these companies to follow the law. So in order to collect fees associated with short-term stays, Airbnb, Vrbo, Booking.com, and other companies must check that a host registration application has been approved. Hosts who violate the rules, as you heard in the video, could face fines of up to $5,000 for repeat offenders, and platforms could be fined up to $1,500 for transactions involving illegal rentals. Now, it's worth getting into how many people will be affected. And I think it's important to get into this number, not because my heart breaks for the people who are making money doing these short-term rentals in the middle of a terrible housing shortage, but because it shows you just how widespread these practices have been at a time when there was a housing crisis. City officials estimated there were roughly 10,800 Airbnb listings as of March of 2023 that were illegal short-term rentals. They have argued that renting those homes to tourists and visitors instead of New Yorkers exacerbates the city's acute housing shortage and makes it even more expensive to live there. I mean, can anyone really deny that claim? That is absolutely true. If you have a housing shortage, having a certain percentage of these apartments dedicated to short-term rentals makes absolutely no sense. It exacerbates the housing crisis. And approximately 73 out of every 10,000 people in New York City currently lack a home. Housing availability is extremely low. New York City's housing stock has only increased 4% since 2010, not nearly enough to keep up with its 22% increase in jobs. And from 2017 to 2021, New York City permitted 13 homes for every 1,000 residents in 2017, while Boston added 28, Washington DC added 43, and Seattle added 64. And as we all know, lower stock of housing leads to much higher housing prices. That's why it's so unbelievably expensive to rent in a lot of these big cities that have very strict zoning laws, which make it difficult to build new housing and which are essentially unregulated as it pertains to these short-term rentals. Half of the city's households, by the way, in New York City do not even have enough money to comfortably hold down an apartment, access sufficient food and basic health care, and get around. And that's according to a report that came out back in April. So look, it is unsurprising to me that these companies have been fighting back tooth and nail against these types of regulations or the enforcement of these types of regulations. So the company sued New York City back in June, but a judge dismissed the case in August, ruling that the restrictions were entirely rational, which I 1000% agree with. But Airbnb isn't the only entity that does not agree with the judge or these decisions. Other arguments against these regulations include, well, the change will make short-term rentals a lot less attractive for many people coming to New York. If you're gonna have a smaller number of these short-term rentals available, that's gonna drive up the cost of these short-term rentals. Sure, that might be the case, or people are going to be forced into renting hotels instead. But I mean, it's a balancing act. What's more important? Ensuring that tourists get the cheapest possible, cheapest possible place to stay as they're traveling, or to ensure that the people actually living in New York City have an affordable place to live in? I would say the latter is more important. Other critics say that the city is bending to the lobbying of the hotel industry. That could be true. The Hotel Trades Council, which is an influential group in local politics and an ally of Eric Adams, has long fought the expansion of the platforms. I don't deny that. I think that's probably true. But I also think it's true that something that might benefit the hotel industry could also benefit the people of New York who literally need not short-term rentals, but apartments to rent. That is the real issue here. And this is my favorite part because short-term rental hosts are also concerned. So I'm gonna share an anecdote. Marganet Moore Roberts rents out a 2-bedroom apartment in her Brooklyn brownstone. She lives in the home's other unit with her husband and teen daughter, but because her family doesn't occupy the second 2-bedroom unit, it can no longer be listed on Airbnb for stays of less than 30 days. So Moore Roberts says she isn't against the rule change entirely, but she wants to see the law reworked to basically make an exception for her with more nuance to protect renters with just one property like herself. By the way, she has 2 properties. She has a property she's living in and a second apartment that she's been renting out for short-term rentals. Let's be clear about that. They've used a very blunt object when they should have used a scalpel, she says. She's currently out of work and she says a drop in income from the short-term rental compounds the financial stress. Putting us all in that same bucket of players is really unfair and not helpful. But I disagree. She could easily rent the second apartment, not as a short-term rental, but as a long-term rental. She would still have a steady stream of income if she does that. It's just that the income might not be as much because you could charge far more for short-term rentals. But again, what is more important? Housing the people who actually live in New York, or providing even more income for someone who is fortunate enough to own a property she lives in and a second property that she rents out. Just rent it out to a long-term tenant. You're gonna be aight. The people who are homeless right now, they're not doing okay. They need a place to live. The people who are working so hard just to make ends meet but can't find an affordable apartment, let's look out for them. I think that's important. So I'm really happy to see that New York City is not only passing these types of regulations, but more importantly, finding mechanisms in which they can enforce these types of regulations. And these types of policies are in fact spreading across the country as well. Dallas has limited short-term rentals to specific neighborhoods to avoid disruptive and dangerous parties. Elsewhere, the Canadian province of Quebec and Memphis, Tennessee, among others, now require licenses for short-term rentals. In San Francisco, Francisco, the amount of time someone can list their entire residence for rent on Airbnb is limited to 90 days each year. Amsterdam puts that limit at 30 nights per year, Paris at 120 days. So good news all around. Santa Monica, California banned renting apartments for less than 30 days as well. Obviously, this idea is spreading, and it's because of the low stock of housing. So either we build a lot more housing or we restrict what our current housing inventory is used for. Do we use it to enrich people who are fortunate enough to own 2 properties or more than 2 properties? Or do we use those properties as shelter, as housing for people who actually need it? Again, I think the latter is more important.
Thanks for watching. If you become a member, you get to watch all this ad-free, except for, of course, this ad. Still, hit the join button below.